أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله، والصلاة والسلام على إمام القبلتين ونبي الحرمين وأفضل الثقلين وجد الحسن والحسين، الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد، وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين الصادقين، والذين ذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. اللهم صل وسلم وزد وبارك على صاحب الدعوة النبوية والسولة الحيدرية والعصمة الفاطمية والحلم الحسنية والشجاعة الحسينية والعبادة السجادية والمآثر الباقرية والآثار الجعفرية والعلوم الكاذمية والحجج الردبية والجود الثقفية والنقابة النقبية والحيبة العسكرية والغيبة الإلهية. اللهم عجل فرجه وسهل مخرجه. أما بعد، فقد قال الله في كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم: ومن أعرض عن ذكري فإن له معيشة ضنكا. صدق الله العلي العظيم. For the love of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. For the love of Fatima az-Zahra salamullahi alayha, in particular, second salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. For the hastening of the reappearance of the master of our time, a louder salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. As we continue to explore the different themes and concepts found within the sermon of Rasulullah in introduction of the month of Shahr Ramadan, a key concept that we find within the sermon is the concept of the dhikr, or the remembrance of Allah. When the Prophet of God emphasized the recitation of the Quran and the recitation of prayer, and in the engagement in supplication or dua, or to stay away from those acts which are prohibited, the underlying feature within all of these different acts within Shahr Ramadan is the remembrance or the dhikr of Allah. But the question over here that arises, which is the fundamental question in tonight's inquiry, is that what does it mean to remember Allah or to engage in dhikrullah? Is dhikrullah is something as simple as saying La ilaha illallah or Alhamdulillah or Subhanallah upon your tongue? Or does this idea of God's remembrance have a deeper reality? Because when you look at the verses of the Quran, you find that there are a number of verses of the Holy Quran which emphasize upon the dhikr of Allah. For example, we'll have a verse which says, فَاذْكُرُونِي أَذْكُرْكُمْ, that the one who remembers me, I remember them. Or in another verse, Allah says, وَمَنْ أَعْرَضَ عَنْ ذِكْرِي فَإِنَّ لَهُ مَعِيشَةً ضَنْكًا, that the one who turns away from my remembrance will live a life of misery. Or in another place, Allah will praise those who remember Allah, and He'll say, الَّذِينَ يَذْكُرُونَ اللَّهَ قِيَامًا وَقُعُودًا وَعَلَى جُنُوبِهِمْ. That these people are those who remember Allah sitting and standing and upon their sides. Or when Allah, He describes the munafiqeen and the hypocrites, He says, لَا يَذْكُرُ اللَّهَ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. That this group of individuals, they only remember Allah a minute or a small amount. All of these verses goes to show that the concept of God's dhikr or remembrance is a fundamental concept within the Holy Quran. And tonight what we'll do is we'll re-examine and we'll explore the different themes which are found within these verses. Because when you examine the different ideas found within these verses, then we'll reach a deeper understanding of what does it mean to engage in the remembrance of Allah or within the dhikr of Allah. And this, as I said, is something which is fundamental within this month. Because when you look at many of the urafa, they divided the act of fasting into 3 different groups. They said that the first type of fasting is the fasting of the or the general people. What this means is that fasting of the general people is that you stay away from food, drink, and all of those different acts which invalidate the fast at the level of the Sharia or the law, and you're engaged in fasting. You find that this is just one level of fasting. Because the second level of fasting is the fast of the khas or the exclusive group. You see, there are a number of individuals and there are a number of different traditions which show fasting is not just at the level of Sharia or law, but rather fasting is at the level of ethics as well. For example, Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi, Imam as-Sadiq would say that when you fast, let your hair fast, and let your skin fast, and let your flesh fast. And the fast of an individual, that day should not be like a day when he's not fasting. In another tradition, we find that one day as Rasulullah is in Medina, he sees that a lady is screaming at her servant. So Rasulullah sends for a portion of food to that lady. When that food is sent to the lady, she says to the Prophet of God that, "O Rasulullah, this is that month of fasting and you're sending me food at this time?" Rasulullah replies by saying that your actions don't reflect the actions of a fasting individual. Because if you were fasting, you wouldn't be yelling at this servant in this manner. So we find that the second group of fasting is that fasting at the level of ethics. But then they say that the third level and the third group of individuals who fast are those individuals when they're in a state of fasting, their hearts in that entire time period are in constant remembrance of God and in constant attention towards Allah. And one can only reach that status when they've understood what is the concept of dhikrullah. And tonight, as we examine this concept, we'll do so in a number of stages using these verses of the Quran. From the first level, we'll examine that what does the Quran say is the true nature of dhikrullah or the remembrance of Allah. From the second level, we'll examine the connection between the remembrance of Allah and the peace of the hearts. From the third level, we'll examine why does the Quran say the one who turns away from the remembrance of Allah will live a life of misery. Number four, we'll examine that in what way does religion bring harmony into the life of a person and a community. And from the fifth level, we'll examine how the concept of dhikr or remembrance applies to the dhikr of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. So as I mentioned at the introductory level, there are a number of verses of the Quran which mention the concept of dhikrullah. And I had posed a question at the beginning, that does this idea of God's remembrance simply mean that we say Alhamdulillah or Subhanallah or La ilaha illallah upon our tongue? Or is there a deeper reality towards that? You see, at the first level, the first concept to understand is that when we have these different recitations upon our tongue, these in reality are not the remembrance of Allah. These are not dhikrullah, but in rather they are a form of dhikrullah. They are a particular aspect of dhikrullah, because the true essence of dhikrullah and God's remembrance is that a believer turns himself towards Allah with intention and seeking help from Allah. In other words, when a person who is truly engaged in dhikrullah, when he says, La ilaha illallah, there is no God except Allah, his very inner being to the outer recitation of his tongue are in unison. That what in his heart is presented upon his tongue. And that is what the state of a believer is. Because when the heart is purified, you find that it manifests itself at every level, upon the tongue of a person and in the actions of an individual as well. You know, Amir al-Mu'mineen would describe the impact of when one is in this state of harmony. For example, the Imam in a tradition says that when you have speech, that word which comes from the heart goes into the heart of an individual. But when words, they come simply from the tongue, they don't go past the ear of an individual. In other words, when a person is in such a state, that impact is not only seen within his life, but it's seen within other aspects as well, and it's able to impact others as well. So what does the Quran say that what is true remembrance of Allah? In one of the verses which I mentioned, the Holy Quran, when it describes the dhikr or the remembrance of Allah, it says, فَاذْكُرُوا اللَّهَ كَذِكْرِكُمْ آبَاءَكُمْ أَوْ أَشَدَّ ذِكْرًا. That when you remember Allah in the way that you would remember your fathers, or with a more intense remembrance. You see, many of us think that to know Allah is simply to have an idea of what Allah is within the mind. I say to you, if you explain the concept of God to an atheist, that idea of God can be in the mind of an atheist as well. And at the end of the day, Shaitan knew Allah. Shaitan, you had the concept of Allah better than you or I did. But there was a disconnect at that level. The Quran says that when you remember Allah in the way that you remember your fathers at the minimum. That when you remember your fathers, you remember that support which your father gave you. You remember the fact that he was a pillar within your life. You remember the fact that your rizq and your sustenance at one point in your life would come through whom? It would come through your father. If you have that type of remembrance for your father, the Quran says the remembrance of Allah should be a greater remembrance. And what is the impact of the remembrance of Allah? The Quran says, فَاذْكُرُونِي أَذْكُرْكُمْ. The one who remembers me, I will remember them. You know, there was a famous scholar. He would say, I know all of those moments where Allah is remembering me. They said to him, how do you know Allah is remembering you? He says, have you not read the verse of the Quran, فَاذْكُرُونِي أَذْكُرْكُمْ. The one who remembers me, I remember them. He says, every time I remember Allah, Allah, He remembers me. So you find that the remembrance of Allah is a profound concept, and it has a profound impact within the life of an individual. This is why in another verse of the Quran, when it describes how one should engage in the remembrance of Allah, the Quran says, وَاذْكُرْ رَبَّكَ إِذَا نَسِيتَ. That the moment you forget Allah, remember Him. That at that moment, that remembrance, it turns away, return to the remembrance of Allah. وَقُلْ أَسَىٰ أَن يَهْدِيَنِي رَبِّي لِأَقْرَبَ مِنْ هَذَا رَشَدًا. And at that moment say that perhaps my Lord will guide me to that which is more upright. In other words, a life of virtue and a life which is more upright, more positive, more beneficial. Such a life requires a person to prolong that remembrance of Allah. And that's why when you look at the Quran has mentioned that there is a profound link between God's remembrance and the inner tranquility and the peace of a human being. You see, the Quran, it says, "Ala bidhikrullahi tatma'innul qulub," that verily with the remembrance of God, the hearts they find rest. But over here, when you look at the verses of the Quran, you find that this peace within the heart goes through two stages. This peace is not a one-stage thing. There are two sets of verses within the Holy Quran. We have one set of verses that when it describes the believers, it says that they're in a state of peace and there's no fear within them. For example, the verse it said, "Ala bidhikrullahi tatma'innul qulub," that by the remembrance of Allah, the hearts they find rest. Another verse will say, "Ala inna awliya Allah la khawfun alayhim wa la hum yahzanun," that those close to Allah, there is no fear within them and there is no sorrow within them. So you find over here we have one set of verses of the Holy Quran. But the second set of verses is very interesting. That although one side it says there is no fear and the believers are in a state of peace, the other set of verses, when they describe the mu'mineen, they say they are in a constant state of fear. For example, the Quran says, إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ الَّذِينَ إِذَا ذُكِرَ اللَّهُ وَجِلَتْ قُلُوبُهُمْ, that the believers are those individuals only that when Allah is mentioned, fear comes to them. So how do we solve this apparent contradiction? On one side, a believer by the remembrance of Allah is in peace. On the other side, a believer, when they remember Allah, you find that at that moment they're in fear. You find that there is one verse from Surah Az-Zumar. It brings together the answer to this question, and it explains that when there is peace through the remembrance of Allah, this peace, it goes through two stages. Allah says in Surah Az-Zumar, "Allahu nazzala ahsan al-hadithi kitaban mutashabihan matani," that Allah, He revealed this book, this discourse, and then He says, "تَقْشَعِرُّ مِنْهُ جُلُودُ الَّذِينَ يَخْشَوْنَ رَبَّهُمْ ثُمَّ تَلِينُ جُلُودُهُمْ وَقُلُوبُهُمْ إِلَى ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ." You know what this verse says? The verse, it says that when this book is revealed and the discourse of this book is given to society, the first thing which happens is that the skin of those who fear Allah, it begins to quiver, it begins to shake out of that fear. But after that first stage of fear is there, after that the second stage is that the skin, it becomes calm and the heart, it becomes calm to the dhikr of Allah. In other words, when it comes to God's remembrance, we go through two stages. At the first stage, we recognize our inadequacy in front of Allah. We recognize our mistakes and our sins, and we have fear, and the skin, it begins to quiver. But at the second level, we remember that the mercy of Allah far exceeds everything else. That's why the Quran says, at first those individuals would be in this state of fear, then secondly they'll achieve this state of tranquility. Because this mercy of Allah is that mercy that when in front of Imam Zainul Abidin salawatullahi wassalamuhu alayh, when in front of Imam Zainul Abidin, an individual by the name of Hassan al-Basri was saying that I am surprised anyone will go towards heaven because the wrath and the ghadab of Allah is so great. Imam Zainul Abidin replied by saying, rather I am surprised that anyone will go to hell because the mercy of Allah is so great. So you find in this manner and in this recognition, Ahlul Bayt would remain in a constant remembrance of Allah. That's why Amir al-Mu'mineen in a famous tradition would say that I sat at the gate of my heart. That this heart requires a gatekeeper. Amir al-Mu'mineen is saying that I sat at the gate of this heart. I was the gatekeeper to this heart, and I let nothing into this heart except for the dhikr and the remembrance of Allah. Because when that dhikr and that remembrance of God leaves the hearts, the Quran it says, وَمَنْ أَعْرَضَ عَنْ ذِكْرِي فَإِنَّ لَهُ مَعِيشَةً ضَنْقًا. That the one who turns away from my remembrance, that individual lives a life of misery. In what ways is the life of a person a life of misery when the remembrance of God it leaves? You see, that individual who doesn't remember that realm of spirituality or remember Allah, you find that their pursuits become simply at the materialistic level. And as much as you acquire of that materialistic realm, you find there will always be a level of dissatisfaction. That's why when you hear of many celebrities or you hear of many individuals who are very accomplished in this world, and news comes out that these individuals had depression or they had an anxiety order, many of us, we think that how can this person have depression? He has $1 billion bank account. This individual has a home which is beautiful. He has all of these resources available. What this goes to show is that there is a natural human condition. And when that human condition, which requires spiritual fulfillment, isn't being fulfilled, no matter whether you are rich or poor, there's going to be dissatisfaction within your life. And over here the Quran is stating, وَمَنْ أَعْرَضَ عَنْ ذِكْرِي, that the one who turns away from my remembrance, they'll undergo through these difficulties at that level. That's why when the religion of Islam it came, it sought to establish harmony through the remembrance of Allah at the personal and at the communal level. At the personal level, even if a person is negligent throughout the day, at the very minimum 5 times a day, he turns towards his Creator at the daily level and he remembers Allah. But at the second level, when this remembrance is occurring, you find it makes an individual more cognizant of the responsibilities of those who are around him. As in one day upon the battlefield, when an individual comes to Amir al-Mu'mineen, an individual says to the Imam, Ya Ali, what is Islam? Now if you and I are asked that what is Islam, a 30-minute dialogue, a 1-hour dialogue, a whole night dialogue, at the end of the night we might not even reach a conclusion. But Amir al-Mu'mineen, he describes the reality of Islam in 2 lines. The Imam says, if you want to understand what Islam is, then Islam is huququllah wa huququl abd. At one level, Islam is to acknowledge the rights of Allah. But at the second level, Islam is to recognize the rights of the creation of Allah. That's why in a tradition, the Imam would say, Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayh. Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq in a tradition would say that to thank the creation of Allah is to thank Allah. And now this may be a very simple tradition, but the idea is quite profound. The idea is this, is that to give the right to those who are around you, this in its own form is to do the remembrance of Allah. That's why the dhikr and the remembrance of Allah has many different ways. It has many different shapes and forms. And from amongst the greatest of those forms is the dhikr of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. That's why we have a tradition that says زَيَّنُوا مَجَالِسَكُمْ بِذِكْرِ عَلِيِّ ibn Abi Talib, that embellish your gatherings with the dhikr of Ali ibn Abi Talib. Or we have another tradition of Imam Muhammad al-Baqir where the Imam will say مَجْتَمَعَ فِي مَجْلِسٍ قَوْمٌ لَمْ يَذْكُرُ اللَّهَ وَلَمْ يَذْكُرُونَ إلا كان ذلك المجلس حسرة عليهم يوم القيامة. You know what the Imam says? The Imam says that no group of individuals will gather in a gathering, and in that gathering Allah is not remembered, nor are we remembered, except for such a gathering will be a source of anguish for them on the Day of Judgment. You see, how will it be a source of anguish? That which gives you agony is what you need the most at that moment, and you're not able to receive it. Right now, our primary concern, for example, may be that food which we receive after iftar, or it may be our health. But on that day, the true reality would be to take opportunity and advantage of the opportunities of this world. That's why any gathering where Allah nor Ahlul Bayt are remembered, the Imam says it'll be a source of anguish for those people on the day of judgment. And then the Imam, he continues. He says, Inna dhikrana min dhikrullah wa dhikra aduwina min dhikr shaitan. The reality of our remembrance is that it is the remembrance of Allah, and it is of the remembrance of Allah, and the remembrance of our enemies is of the remembrance of Satan and Shaitan. So you find in this manner, the idea of dhikr or remembrance is an idea which is not just a recitation upon the tongue, but rather dhikr and remembrance for all of these benefits to come is a state of being which exists within our lives, and we carry it out on a day-to-day basis. And that's why when you look at the companions of Ahlul Bayt, you find that time and time again they would remind themselves and they would go through this concept of dhikr. And amongst those individuals was Aba Fadl Abbas on the day of Ashura. That what was the dhikr and the remembrance of Aba Fadl Abbas? It stated when Aba Fadl, he reaches the Furat and he looks at the water of the Furat. He says, Ya nafsu min ba'd al-Husayn huni wa ba'dahu la kunti aw takuni hada Husaynun waridul manuni وَتَشْرَبِينَ بَارِدَ الْمَعِينِ. You know what Aba Fadl Abbas says? Aba Fadl Abbas begins to remind his own soul. He says, O soul, after Hussein, what is there within this world? After Hussein, neither were you nor will you be. You want to drink from this water when the son of Fatima is drinking from the water of death at that moment. You see, when Aba Fadl Abbas, he returns with the water towards the tents, it's stated that Aba Fadl Abbas, he carries the water upon the flag in his right arm. And they cut the right arm of Aba Fadl Abbas. Aba Fadl Abbas says, Wallah in qata'tum yamini, inni ohami abadan an dini, wa an imamin sadiqin yaqini. Aba Fadl Abbas, what was the dhikr of Abbas? Abbas was absorbed in the dhikr of Sayyid al-Shuhada. He says, you want to cut my right arm? By Allah, if you cut this arm, I will not stop the difa in the defense of the Imam. Then they cut the left arm of Aba Fadl Abbas. You know, there was a reciter in Karbala reciting the musibah of Aba Fadl. And as he was in Karbala, a scholar by the name of Shaykh Yahya Yatribi, he said to that reciter, O man, you recited that an arrow went into the eye of Abbas. You don't know if this musibah is authentic, don't recite this musibah. Shaykh Yahya Yatribi, he narrates, that night I saw Aba Fadl Abbas in my dream. And Abbas, he said to me that why did you stop my reciter? Shaykh Yahya Yatribi, he says that I didn't know if the Masaib was authentic. Aba Fadl Abbas says the musibah was authentic. An arrow went into my eye. But whenever something goes into your eyes, what is your first reaction? Your first reaction is to use your arms. I didn't have any arms. I would look to the left. I would look to the right. You know what I did? I put that arrow in between my knees. Using my knees, I pulled that arrow out of my eye. You know, in Karbala, a time had come that water had come into the shrine of Aba Fadl Abbas. And when water had come into that shrine, Sayyid Mahdi Bahar al-Ulum was instructed to watch over the construction. As Sayyid Mahdi Bahar al-Ulum was there, one of the workers, they said to the Sayyid that, "Oh Sayyid, you would always tell us that Abbas was a very tall individual. My only question for you is that why is the grave of Abbas so small?" Sayyid Bahar al-Ulum, he takes off his turban. He says, "Oh man, Abbas is that shaheed that not only did they cut the neck of Abbas, but they broke the limb of Abbas into pieces. This is Aba Fadl Abbas. Ala la'natullah ala al-qawm al-dhalimeen." We ask through the right of Aba Fadl Abbas, it's stated that when water is in front of you, remember Hussein. But in these days of fasting, when water is in front of us and we're not able to drink, we remember Aba Fadl Abbas. That through the right of Babul Hawaij, wherever the followers of Ahlul Bayt are in difficulty, help them. Wherever they're sick and ailing, cure them. There are many in this hall who have difficulties, who have hajat. Through the right of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad, grant these hajat towards them. Allow us to have the tawfiq to benefit from the teachings of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad, and grant us the ziyarah of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. And we pray for the hastening of the reappearance of the 12th from Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم. With your loudest salawat, we'll recite a Surah Al-Fatiha for each of your marhumin. Afterwards, صلوا على محمد وآل محمد.